This is a spoken summary of Frank Dikötter's book, Mao's Great Famine, The History of China's Most Devastating Catastrophe, 1958 to 1962. The book argues that the Great Leap Forward was not a natural disaster, nor a simple economic blunder, but a man-made catastrophe rooted in coercion, terror, and systematic violence, in which at least 45 million people died unnecessarily. Drawing on more than 1,000 party archival documents opened for the first time, Dikötter reconstructs how the disaster unfolded, from the corridors of power in Beijing down to the villages where ordinary people struggled to survive. What follows moves through the book in its own order. First, the political drama that launched the leap, then the anatomy of the destruction, and finally, the ways in which people lived and died. Preface. Dikötter opens with a stark image. Between 1958 and 1962, China descended into hell. Mao Zedong set out to catch up with and overtake Britain in less than 15 years, mobilizing a labor force counted in the hundreds of millions. China would, in his phrase, walk on two legs, pursuing agriculture and industry at once, rather than following the Soviet model of industry alone. Everything was collectivized. Villagers were herded into giant communes, and food, distributed by the spoonful in collective canteens according to merit, became a weapon. The central claim of the preface is that the true dimensions of this catastrophe have remained little known because the party archives were long closed. Unlike the crimes of Pol Pot, Hitler, or Stalin, the scale of the Chinese disaster was hidden. A new archive law opened vast material, and Dikötter draws on well over 1,000 documents from dozens of party collections across the country, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing to the provincial archives of Hebei, Sichuan, Gansu, Hunan, and beyond. Earlier estimates, extrapolated from census figures, had ranged from 15 to 32 million excess deaths. His archives point to a higher figure. At least 45 million people died unnecessarily. Dikötter rejects the very word famine, which implies an unintended consequence. He insists instead that coercion, terror, and systematic violence were the foundation of the Great Leap Forward. By rough approximation, he estimates that 6 to 8% of the victims were tortured to death or summarily killed, amounting to at least 2.5 million people. The destruction went far beyond human life. Backyard furnaces consumed pots, pans, and tools, livestock collapsed, and up to 40% of all housing was turned into rubble. Corruption, he writes, spread from soy sauce to hydraulic dams. In some provinces, up to half the trees were lost. Dikötter calls the Great Leap Forward the pivotal event in the history of the People's Republic, an event that would later force Mao into the Cultural Revolution to retain his grip on power. The archives, he says, reveal a leader given to vicious backstabbing and bullying, rambling and obsessed with his own role in history, insensitive to human loss. Yet he insists that Mao could not have prevailed alone. Responsibility extended through a chain of interest reaching from Beijing to the village, and Mao depended on lieutenants like Liu Shaoqi and Zhou Enlai. At the same time, ordinary people were not merely passive victims. Survival came increasingly to depend, in his words, on the ability to lie, charm, hide, steal, cheat, pilfer, forage, smuggle, trick, manipulate, or otherwise outwit the state. Borrowing Primo Levi's idea of the gray zone, Dikötter refuses to romanticize this as heroic resistance. Obfuscation, he writes, was the communist way of life. The book is organized in 6 parts, moving from how the leap unfolded, to the scale of destruction, to everyday survival, and finally to the many ways in which people died. Chapter 1. Two Rivals. The first chapter traces the roots of the Great Leap to Mao's long and humiliating subordination to Moscow. Dikötter writes that Stalin's death in 1953 was Mao's liberation. For decades, Mao had depended on Soviet money while enduring Soviet contempt. From the age of 27, he had received Soviet funds, but always with reprimands attached. Stalin had favored Chiang Kai-shek even after the Shanghai Massacre of 1927, ordered the release of the kidnapped Generalissimo in 1936, and suspected Mao of being a peasant, a caveman Marxist, another Tito. When Mao finally visited Moscow at the end of 1949, he was rebuffed and given the cold shoulder, whisked away to a dacha for weeks, and secured only limited aid, $300 million over 5 years, alongside humiliating concessions over Manchuria and Xinjiang. The Korean War, Dikötter notes, deepened Mao's hold over his colleagues but also his resentment, as Stalin obstructed peace and demanded payment for equipment. Khrushchev, whom Stalin had once mockingly called his little Marx, tapping his pipe against Khrushchev's forehead and joking that it was hollow, proved more generous, financing hundreds of factories and training some 10,000 Chinese students. But the turning point came in 1956, when Khrushchev denounced Stalin in his secret speech without consulting Mao. Mao publicly welcomed the move, since it weakened Moscow's authority, but never forgave it, seeing de-Stalinization as a challenge to his own position. At home, Mao's push for a socialist high tide had run into shortages and resistance, and cautious colleagues like Zhou Enlai and Chen Yun called for an end to what they termed rash advance. On a People's Daily editorial critical of his approach, Mao scrawled, "I will not read this," and later, "Why should I read something that abuses me?" By late 1957, having drawn out and then crushed his critics in the 100 Flowers campaign and its anti-rightist aftermath, which targeted 500,000 people under Deng Xiaoping, Mao had regained the initiative. The slogan of rash advance was replaced by the leap forward, and Mao, Dikötter writes, was ready to challenge Khrushchev. Chapter 2. The bidding starts. In November 1957, Mao traveled to Moscow for the 40th anniversary of the October Revolution. The Soviet launch of Sputnik a month earlier had convinced him, in his famous phrase, that the east wind prevails over the west wind. Khrushchev, who had barely survived a coup by the Stalinist hardliners Molotov, Malenkov, and Kaganovich, needed Mao's support, and treated the Chinese delegation lavishly, housing them alone among 64 delegations in the Great Kremlin Palace, Mao in Empress Catherine's private quarters, though he insisted on using his own chamber pot. Mao repaid this attention ambiguously. In public, he affirmed Soviet leadership, saying that China did not qualify to be the head, that it lacked experience, and that if the Soviet Union was not the head, then who was? In private, he undercut Khrushchev, praising the very hardliners Khrushchev had just defeated, and musing coldly about nuclear war, remarking that of the world's 2.7 billion people, even if a third or half died, imperialism would be erased. Dikötter notes dryly that he was bluffing, and called the United States a paper tiger. The decisive moment was economic. Following Khrushchev's boast that the Soviet Union would overtake the United States in output within 15 years, Mao immediately responded that in 15 years China might well catch up with or overtake Britain. With that declaration, Dikötter writes, the great leap forward had begun. Chapter 3. Purging the ranks. Back in China, Mao consolidated the leap by securing the endorsement of top leaders like Liu Shaoqi and the planner Li Fuchun, and then by systematically breaking all resistance. Through a series of conferences at Hangzhou, Nanning, and Chengdu in early 1958, he humiliated the economic planners who had opposed rash advance. He told one, "I will not listen to that stuff of yours," and warned that opposing rash advance had discouraged 600 million people. Those who had poured cold water, he said, were only 50 meters away from the rightists. So intense was the pressure that one senior official collapsed, begged to be saved, and later died after leaping through a window. His chief target was Zhou Enlai. Brandishing an article by the Shanghai boss Ke Qingxi, Mao mocked Zhou, asking whether the premier could write anything as good, and declared, "I am opposed to opposition to rash advance." Zhou was forced into repeated, abject self-criticisms, at last calling Mao the personification of truth to save his position. Dikötter offers a memorable summary. Mao Zedong was the visionary, Zhou Enlai the midwife who transformed nightmares into reality. Mao also encouraged a cult of personality, asking, "What is wrong with worship? The truth is in our hands. Why should we not worship it?" The purge then percolated downward, carried by Deng Xiaoping to regional meetings. Mao tapped provincial ambition, praising radicals like Wu Zhipu and Henan while dismissing the caution of others. He liked to say that the poor were blank, and that blank paper is ideal for writing. In Gansu, some 190,000 people were denounced, and 40,000 cadres expelled. In Yunnan, thousands were removed. Across the country, moderate officials were swept aside and replaced with radicals willing to enforce the leap by any means, unleashing waves of local violence and, In places like Fengxian County, 100 suicides in a single summer. Chapter 4. Bugle Call. The Great Leap began in practice as a colossal water conservancy campaign, substituting mass labor for capital. Some 30 million people were recruited in October 1957, and by January, 1 in 6 people in the country was digging earth. More than 580 million cubic meters of rock and soil were moved before the year was out. The chapter surveys the grandiose and largely useless projects that followed. The Three-Gate Gorge Dam on the Yellow River, that river long called China's sorrow, was built in haste against the warnings of the engineer Huang Wanli. It quickly silted up, its turbines were removed as useless, and it threatened the city of Xi'an with flooding. In Gansu, the Tao River project aimed to send water up the mountains, some 900 kilometers, and was blessed with a marshal's calligraphy. It was abandoned in 1962, having irrigated, in Dikötter's damming summary, 0 hectares, at a cost of 150 million yuan, with at least 2,400 dead. The showcase was the Ming Tombs Reservoir near Beijing, where Mao himself posed with a shovel and 2 buckets of earth for the national press, under banners promising that 3 years of hard work meant 10,000 years of happiness. It, too, was built in the wrong place, dried up, and was abandoned. One official confessed that the figures they gathered were obvious exaggerations, but no one had the energy to check them. In Yunnan, the boss Jie Fuji drove some 2.5 million people, a third of the workforce, to move earth up to 10 hours a day. In Luliang County, the first villagers began dying of hunger and edema in early 1958, and by June, 1,000 were dead, though frightened doctors dared not diagnose hunger. Mao understood the human cost in advance. Discussing the projects, he remarked that Wu Zhipu claimed he could move 30 billion cubic meters of earth, and added, "I think 30,000 people will die." Villagers in Gansu called these projects the killing fields. Chapter 5. Launching Sputniks. This chapter examines how Mao drove a system of relentless target inflation, known as launching Sputniks. Through personal goading, telephone conferences, and multiple tiers of planning, unrealistic quotas cascaded down the hierarchy in what Dikötter calls an orgy of inflation all the way down to the village. An emulation system of red, gray, and white flags rewarded compliance and shamed the cautious. As Mao punned, what we call comparison is really compulsion. One county official recalled being blasted for a white flag and having to leave his pregnant wife and dying sister to return to the work site. The result was a vast gap between fantastical claims and reality. The model site of Chaishan in Henan set a wheat goal, and by year's end reported an entirely fictitious yield of 37.5 tons per hectare. Villagers were forced to create Sputnik fields, tearing down tens of thousands of houses for fertilizer, and cramming seedlings together in pseudoscientific schemes of deep plowing and close cropping. Those who objected were beaten. As one interviewee said, "We knew about the situation, but no one dared to say anything." Inspections were carefully stage-managed, with undesirable elements hidden in labor camps and banquets laid on for visitors. As Mao's Dr. Li Jisui observed, all of China was a stage, all the people performers, in an extravaganza for Mao. Believing in a fictitious surplus, Mao grew euphoric. Visiting Zhushui, he asked how the villagers would eat so much grain, and told them, "You should eat more. Even 5 meals a day is fine." The belief in an enormous harvest, Dikötter shows, would soon become the basis for punishing procurement. Chapter 6. Let the shelling begin. In the summer of 1958, Mao ruptured relations with Khrushchev, angrily rejecting a Soviet proposal for a joint fleet and radio stations on the Chinese coast. "You just don't trust the Chinese," he told the Soviet ambassador. "Russians are superior beings, and the Chinese are inferior, careless people." When Khrushchev flew to Beijing, Mao received him coolly, with no red carpet and no guards of honor, and at one point summoned the non-swimming Soviet leader to a poolside meeting, showing off his own strokes while Khrushchev floundered in a lifebelt. Mao also boasted that China had so much rice, it no longer knew what to do with it, leaving Khrushchev privately baffled that a hungry country claimed too much food. Then, without warning Moscow, Mao ordered the shelling of the nationalist-held offshore islands of Quemoy and Matsu. The manufactured crisis forced the Soviets to extend their nuclear umbrella while wrecking the détente Mao despised. The islands, he gloated, were 2 batons that kept Khrushchev and Eisenhower dancing. But the real purpose, Dikötter argues, was domestic. "A tense situation," Mao said. helps to mobilize people, in particular those who are backward. Everyone in our country is a soldier. An East German student called it the communism of the barracks, and its true expression was the People's Commune. Chapter 7. The People's Communes. The People's Communes merged collectives into giant militarized units, abolishing private property and wages. Modeled on Sushui County, where the leader Zhang Guozhong had organized 100,000 people into battalions and companies living in barracks, the communes were hailed by Mao as possibly the bridge to communism that Stalin had never found. "This term, People's Commune, is great," he said. By the end of 1958, the countryside had been reorganized into some 26,000 communes, some with up to 20,000 households. Daily life was militarized, governed by the terms militarization, combatization, and disciplinization. Villagers rose to a bugle, ate a watery gruel, marched to the fields, and gathered for evening evaluation meetings. Wages were abolished, and the value of a work point collapsed, in one county from over a yuan a day to 16 cents, which villagers likened to beating a drum with a cucumber. Confiscation was total. As one leader in Sichuan put it, even shit has to be collectivized. Panicked villagers slaughtered their livestock, one man working through his chickens, ducks, dogs, and finally, the cat. Homes were demolished for bricks and fuel, with one campaign in Gansu pulverizing some 10,000 dwellings under slogans promising to build communism in 100 days. Dikötter records the anguish of a villager who said that destroying his home was even worse than digging up his ancestor's gravestone. Most villagers disliked the collective canteens. In Hunan, over 2/3 opposed them. But coercion forced them in, and for about 2 months following Mao's exhortation, people overate the confiscated stores in a brief orgy of consumption, even pouring leftover rice down the toilets. The feast, Dikötter writes, did not last. Chapter 8. Steel Fever. Mao's obsession with steel, which Dikötter calls the sacred ingredient in the alchemy of socialism, drove a frenzied backyard furnace campaign. The 1958 target was raised again and again, from just over 5 million tons to 12, and Mao dreamed of overtaking the United States and eventually producing hundreds of millions of tons. He believed that the humble are the cleverest, the privileged are the dumbest, and rejected the caution of geological surveys and bourgeois specialists. Tens of millions of people were mobilized to build small furnaces, tearing floorboards from homes and melting down pots, pans, and tools. The metallurgy minister assured Mao poolside that doubling steel was, in his words, no problem. Coercion was pervasive, with 2 new instruments of violence emerging, the commune militia and food used as reward and punishment. As one villager recalled, "You did as you were told, otherwise the boss gave you no food. His hand held the ladle. The result was mostly worthless." Much of the output was brittle slag or unwashed ore, and the metallurgy ministry later admitted that in many provinces not even 1/3 was usable. A ton of backyard iron cost far more than a modern furnaces, and the state's statistical bureau later estimated the iron and steel losses of 1958 at 5 billion yuan. The campaign also drained agriculture of its labor just as the harvest needed gathering. More than 15 million farmers moved to the cities in 1958. Women and the inexperienced took over the fields, and crops rotted. Worst of all, the fictitious grain figures, an estimated 410 million tons against an actual output of just over 200 million, became the basis for state procurement. Tan Zenlin captured the coming brutality. "You need to fight against the peasants," he said. "There is something ideologically wrong with you if you are afraid of coercion." Chapter 9. Warning Signs. Famine and mass death appeared early, in the spring and summer of 1958, even before the communes were fully established. As farmers were pulled from the fields onto irrigation projects, hunger spread. By the end of April, hundreds of thousands were starving in Shandong, over 1 million were destitute in Anhui, 1 in 10 farmers in Hunan had been out of grain for over a month, and children were being sold in Hebei and Guangdong. In Luliang County, Yunnan, 1 in 6 villagers died between January and August, some 1,600 people under a violent local boss. Across the wider Purging region, official archives recorded 82,000 deaths in 1958, and the province's death rate reached more than double the national average. Dikötter shows that Mao received abundant and credible reports of these deaths, yet treated them as isolated lessons rather than reasons to reverse course. He annotated one report that these kinds of problems may not be restricted to one commune alone, but simply switched his allegiance from one model county to another. The prevailing attitude was that casualties were an acceptable price. The foreign minister Chen Yi captured it bluntly, saying that casualties had indeed appeared, but it was a price they had to pay, and that a few cases of illness and death was nothing. Rather than retreat, the regime prioritized feeding the cities and honoring exports, and from the end of 1958, Zhou Enlai, backed by Mao, pressed the countryside for ever greater procurements. Chapter 10. Shopping Spree. To power its leap into industry, China went on a massive import binge of foreign equipment, from tractors and machine tools to entire turnkey factories, roughly 300 complete plants, mostly from the Soviet Union but increasingly from Western Europe as the American embargo eroded. The bill had to be paid in food and raw materials extracted from the starving countryside. Over half of China's exports to the Soviet Union were agricultural, and the value of rice shipped to Moscow trebled between 1957 and 1959. Soviet loans carried debt service installments of over 200 million rubles a year. The policy of larger imports, larger exports, championed by Jude, placed the entire burden on the farmers. The chapter also records a self-inflicted trade disaster, as China dumped cloth abroad below cost, simply to claim the title of the world's third-largest exporter. The foreign trade minister Ye Jizhuang admitted, "We really hurt ourselves, we frightened our friends, and we awakened our enemies." Zhou Enlai, who oversaw trade, insisted contracts be honored, saying he would rather that they ate less and consumed less, as long as they honored contracts signed with foreigners. Mao went further, musing that perhaps nobody should eat meat so that all of it could be exported. Even as people starved, China shipped out over 4 million tons of grain in 1959. Chapter 11. Dizzy with Success. Between late 1958 and mid-1959, as evidence of damage mounted, Mao shrewdly shifted blame onto local cadres while posing as a benevolent leader restraining the excesses of others. "I now support conservatism," he said slyly. "I stand on the side of right deviation." Dikötter stresses that this cooling off was not a genuine retreat. Core policies continued, and the crisis was reframed not as a problem of over-procurement, but of peasants and cadres hiding grain. Reports from Zhejiang in Guangdong and Zheng Zisheng in Anhui gave Mao this convenient lifeline, recasting shortage as an ideological failing. The comparison Dikötter draws is with Stalin's 1930 article Dizzy with Success, which had at least allowed farmers to leave the collectives. Mao did almost nothing of the kind. Indeed, requisitions were drastically increased. At a top-secret meeting at the Jinjiang Hotel in Shanghai in March 1959, Mao ordered a third of all grain to be procured, and uttered one of the most chilling lines Dikötter records. "When there is not enough to eat, people starve to death. It is better to let half of the people die, so that the other half can eat their fill." This slogan, "He who strikes first prevails," was understood by officials as an instruction to seize grain before farmers could eat it. Deng Xiaoping, tellingly, was the one senior figure Mao never named among his past opponents. As Deng put it, "We need to warm up, not cool down." Chapter 12. The End of Truth. The chapter centers on the Lushan Conference of July and August 1959, which Dikötter presents as the tragic turning point of the whole catastrophe. Convened as a relaxed meeting of immortals in a mountain resort, it offered a genuine chance to correct course. The defense minister Peng Dehuai, disturbed by what he had seen touring the countryside, including Mao's own home region, wrote the chairman a measured, honest letter. He acknowledged achievements but criticized the petty bourgeois fanaticism behind the excesses and noted the waste of the steel campaign. Peng insisted responsibility reached the very top, asking how Mao, who had set the 10.7 million ton steel target, could escape responsibility. Mao chose to treat this honest critique as a treasonous anti-party plot. He was further enraged by Khrushchev's public criticism of the communes at the same moment, which he feared signaled collusion. Distributing Peng's letter and summoning reinforcements, Mao delivered a 3-hour speech threatening to split the army and take to the countryside. Over a 2-week struggle session, Peng and his supposed allies, including Zhang Wentian, who had dared invert Mao's metaphor to say the shortcomings outweighed the achievements 9-1, were condemned. Lin Biao denounced Peng as ambitious and hypocritical, insisting only Mao was a great hero. By destroying the one senior figure willing to speak plainly, Mao ended any possibility of truth-telling within the party, with catastrophic consequences. Chapter 13. Repression. After Lushan, a nationwide witch hunt purged anyone who had questioned the leap. Some 3.6 million party members were labeled or purged as rightists in 1959 and 60. The army was purged, and Lin Biao rewarded with Peng Dehuai's post, though his private diary, later found by Red Guards, called the leap based on fantasy, and a total mess. Moderate cadres everywhere were replaced by ruthless radicals. In Gansu, the boss, Zhang Zhongliang, covered up mass death, assuring Mao of a bumper harvest even as his province starved. Dikötter highlights the case of Zhou Xiaozhou in Hunan, a relatively cautious leader who had scoffed at inflated grain figures, questioned the supply system, and recalled men from the backyard furnaces. He was purged immediately after Lushan. The consequence of this repression, Dikötter argues, was decisive. Here he offers his central counterfactual. Had the leadership reversed course at Lushan, the famine's victims would have numbered in the millions. Instead, with every honest voice silenced and every cautious official removed, farmers were left utterly exposed to unchecked party power, and tens of millions died. Chapter 14. The Sino-Soviet Rift. In July 1960, the Soviet Union recalled its 1,500 advisors. Dikötter argues this did comparatively little real economic damage, but Mao exploited it to build an enduring myth that the famine was caused by Soviet pressure to repay loans. In fact, the reverse was true. China had the option to repay over many years, yet insisted on repaying its debts early, sending some 500 million rubles worth of food and goods to Moscow between 1960 and 62, precisely as tens of millions starved. The Soviets never demanded accelerated payment. On the contrary, they later offered to refinance the balance as new credit and to supply grain and sugar. Mao chose the path of pride, invoking the hardships of the wartime base at Yan'an. "We want to fasten our belts," he said, "and try to pay the money back within 5 years." The myth proved remarkably durable. Decades later, survivors interviewed by Dikötter still believed that the Soviet Union had forced China to repay its loans, an explanation that conveniently shifted blame away from Beijing. The recall's main effect, Dikötter suggests, was on Mao himself, who grew so depressed that summer that he took to his bed, in a strategic retreat that opened space for corrective policies. Chapter 15. Capitalist Grain. After the rift with Moscow, a bankrupt China turned to the West and for the first time imported grain from capitalist countries, buying close to 6 million tons from Canada and Australia in 1960 and 61. It was Beijing, not Moscow, that uncoupled the economy from the socialist bloc, using the cover story of unprecedented natural catastrophes. To raise the hard currency, China dumped goods, redirected food to Hong Kong, and sold off some 50 to 60 million ounces of silver. Yet even now, pride and the desire for prestige prevailed over its people's hunger. China continued to export food and to give it away as aid, sending free grain to Albania, whose negotiator, Pupo Shiti, recalled that the Chinese gave us everything, and that he felt ashamed. It shipped rice to Cuba and Guinea, prompting Guangzhou workers to ask why they should export to Cuba when they did not have enough to eat. Between 1950 and 60, China gave some 4 billion yuan in foreign aid. It refused nearly all offers of foreign help, from President Kennedy, the Red Cross, and Japan, and even declined Khrushchev's offer of 1 million tons of grain, unwilling to admit the scale of the disaster to the world. Chapter 16. Finding a Way Out. The turning point out of the famine came when the horrifying truth became undeniable. The chapter centers on the Xinjiang atrocity in Henan, in the model province of Wujipu, where over 1 million people died in 1960, some 67,000 of them clubbed to death by militias. In the county Dikötter calls ground zero, 1 in 4 of a population of 500,000 perished. When the report reached Beijing, landing on Li Fuchun's desk, Mao was visibly shaken. Cautious planners engineered a strategic retreat under the slogan of adjustment, and an emergency directive in November 1960 began to restore private plots, side occupations, and local markets, which Dikötter calls the beginning of the end of mass starvation. The decisive break came from Liu Shaoqi. Setting out in April 1961 to his own home village in Hunan, he found a fake pig farm, slept in a fodder store, and saw children in rags digging for wild herbs. Confronted by relatives who told him that man-made disasters are the main reason, he apologized to the villagers, saying he had not done his job well and begging their pardon, and dissolved the canteen that evening. In a landmark speech on the 31st of May, he adopted the Hunanese verdict that the disaster was 30% natural and 70% man-made, and declared that the center is the principal culprit. Li Fuqing's assessment that July, endorsed by Mao at a Lushan meeting in August, marked what Dikötter calls the true turning point in the famine. Mao, in sullen retreat, blamed class enemies, but allowed the corrective policies to proceed, telling his doctor bitterly that all the good party members were dead, and the only ones left were a bunch of zombies. Chapter 17. Agriculture. Beginning the part of the book that anatomizes the destruction, this chapter argues that the famine was the structural product of a command economy, not an accident of overestimated harvests. Since 1953, the state had held a monopoly on grain, defining a farmer's surplus as a political construct. The ration it left behind, around 13 to 15 kilos a head each month, fell well below the 23 to 26 kilos of unhusked grain needed for basic subsistence. Grain, Dikötter writes, became the currency of exchange. During the leap, quotas were bid ever higher up the hierarchy, and procurement rates soared far above the normal 20 to 25%, reaching 30 to 37% nationally, and, in provinces like Guizhou, over 50%, precisely as harvests collapsed. Mao knew this. If you don't go above a third, he said, people won't rebel. The idea that the state took too much by mistake, Dikötter insists, is largely a myth, true at most for the autumn of 1958. Political priorities consistently trumped rural survival, as grain flowed to the cities and abroad. Zhou Enlai pushed requisitions relentlessly, and Deng Xiaoping praised the ruthless extraction in Sichuan, where millions died, saying he approved of the Sichuan style, that they never moaned about hardship, and adding that he was not saying this because he himself was from Sichuan. The chapter catalogues the wider ruin. Disastrous farming techniques, close cropping, and deep plowing wasted the harvest, and cadres were even ordered to plant less. Grain rotted in the fields for lack of transport and in storage from vermin and damp. Livestock collapsed, with pig populations in Hunan falling from nearly 13 million to under 3.5 million, and a third to a half of all farm tools were lost, many thrown into the backyard furnaces. Meanwhile, commercial crops like cotton, having no subsistence threshold, were requisitioned almost completely, so that cloth was rationed to a single meter a year, and farmers were left, as the future leader Hu Yaobang saw with his own eyes, stark naked. Chapter 18. Industry. The same obsession with quantity over cost and quality wrecked industry. With output the supreme goal, and with no factory permitted to go bankrupt, since that was a capitalist phenomenon, failure was simply masked. The chapter documents staggering waste, shoddy and dangerous goods, and mounting financial losses. Steel was so brittle, it snapped in the rolling mills, cement failed its standards, and a survey in Kaifeng found more than 70% of output was reject product. Some 78 million bottles of bad penicillin were produced. Mao waved this away, saying there is no such thing as a reject product. One man's reject is another man's grain. The defects reached the military, with rifles that would not fire. As one report noted, the Americans doubt that we can make guided missiles because the Chinese are too dirty. Worker conditions were appalling. Dikötter describes a steel plant without toilets, where workers relieved themselves on the floor, dormitories offering barely a square meter per person, and widespread industrial disease, from silicosis to the amenorrhea, tuberculosis, and worm infestations suffered by malnourished women in makeshift, run by the people workshops. Medical fees could be ruinous, leaving a bereaved worker owing 1,700 yuan. By 1961, up to half of Beijing's workforce showed signs of famine edema. When the economy finally slumped in that year, production collapsed. Machinery made of brittle steel lasted mere months, and output in many sectors fell by half or more. Chapter 19. Trade. Replacing a rich, flexible market economy with a rigid state distribution system destroyed the circulation of goods. Transport broke down, with 1 million tons of freight piling up north of Shanghai and imported goods rotting untouched in depots for months. The lively commercial world of the pre-revolutionary era, its itinerant traders, periodic markets, and department stores lit at night, was dismantled. In Nanjing, the number of shops fell from over 700 to 130, and endemic shortages forced people to queue for days for basic goods. Some took 2 days off work simply to line up for grain. The state's control of prices produced a massive transfer of wealth from countryside to city. Farmers sold grain at rock-bottom prices, while paying inflated prices for manufactured goods, some of which had risen in cost by over 200%. Li Fuchen reckoned that 12.5 billion yuan had been squandered on goods worth 7 billion. Even repair services became a bureaucratic absurdity, where fixing an item often cost more than buying a new one, while defective goods piled up unmended for want of nails. Dikötter recalls one man's memory of the model commune of Shushui, where his mother had to queue simply to borrow the only unconfiscated sewing needle in the neighborhood. Chapter 20. Housing. Dikötter calls the Great Leap the greatest demolition of property in human history. In the cities, whole districts were leveled for vanity projects, as every dictator, he notes, needs a square. Beijing's Tiananmen was expanded to hold 400,000 people, and the 10 great buildings were rushed up for the 10th anniversary of the revolution, often riddled with defects, while historic walls, temples, and even stretches of the Great Wall were plundered for materials, on the principle that bricks belong to the masses. Li Fuchen himself protested, "People cannot eat their fill, and we are still building skyscrapers. How can we communists have the heart to do that?" In the countryside, homes were destroyed in successive waves, for fertilizer, for fuel, for iron and steel, in militia searches for hidden grain, and finally, by starving villagers cannibalizing their own homes for anything to burn or barter. Liu Shaoyi reported to Mao that 40% of all houses in Hunan had been destroyed, and in Sichuan, the destruction ran higher still, with families crammed into toilets or under eaves. Even the dead were evicted, their graves flattened for stone, timber, and fertilizer. As one man recalled, they were ordered at night to destroy the graveyards and turn them into farming land. In the most grotesque cases, Dikötter records, bodies were simmered in cauldrons into fertilizer for the fields. Chapter 21. Nature. This chapter argues that the natural catastrophes the leadership blamed were overwhelmingly man-made, the product of Mao's ideology of a war against nature, in which human will could conquer and reshape the environment. "There is a new war," Mao declared. "We should open fire on nature." The steel campaign and unchecked logging stripped the forests, with some provinces losing 1/3 to 1/2 of their trees, causing erosion, landslides, and desertification. Reckless irrigation schemes disturbed the water table so badly that, as Hu Yaobang put it after touring 1,800 kilometers, the projects had become an evil dragon turning the land into a sea. Ordinary rainfall now had nowhere to go, producing devastating floods, while salinization ruined perhaps 1/10 of all irrigated cropland. The most notorious episode was the campaign to exterminate sparrows, blamed for eating grain. Mobilized to bang pots and wave cloths until the exhausted birds dropped from the sky, people then discovered the ecological blowback. With the sparrows gone and pesticides squandered in the frenzy, insect infestations devastated the crops, and by 1960, locusts and other pests were destroying great swaths of the harvest. Pollution went untreated, with rivers poisoned by phenol and factory waste. Dam collapses were frequent, and Dikötter notes that 2 dams built in this campaign, Bengqiao and Shamantan, would collapse in a 1975 typhoon, drowning an estimated 230,000 people. Mao, Dikötter concludes, lost his war against nature, decimating human life as a result. Chapter 22. Feasting through famine. Despite its egalitarian rhetoric, the People's Republic built an elaborate hierarchy that determined access to food and goods by rank. Communist states, Dikötter argues, built such hierarchies out of fear and out of the logic of a command economy that distributed by priority rather than demand. Each official, in the phrase he quotes, was the anvil of his superiors and the hammer of his subordinates. The linchpin was the household registration system, modeled on the Soviet internal passport, which divided the population into city dwellers and peasants, and tied farmers to the land as a hereditary caste, denied the urban privileges of subsidized housing, rations, health, and education. Status passed through the mother, so a village girl who married a city man remained a farmer, as did her children. Within the party, an internal hierarchy governed access to everything, down to the very quality of one's cigarettes, which improved rank by rank. At the apex, leaders lived in walled residences, with round-the-clock guards, chauffeured cars, and food tasters, while Mao's bedroom, Dikötter notes, was the size of a ballroom. Party membership swelled from 12.5 million to over 17 million, despite the purges. Meetings became occasions for feasting. By 1960, roughly one high-level conference was held for every day of the year, and some 50,000 officials descended on Shanghai. In one famine-ravaged Guizhou County, 260 officials consumed in 4 days hundreds of kilos of meat, hundreds of chickens, and dozens of liters of wine. Some 250 cadres took a lavish 25-day cruise down the Yangtze, the ship illuminated like a rainbow. Rapacious officials were nicknamed Pigsy cadres, after the gluttonous part pig character in the classic novel. Ordinary people found scraps where they could, one farmer observing bitterly that the cadres openly steal, while the commune members secretly rob. In the cities, meanwhile, some canteens wasted so much food that trodden buns covered the floors and kilos of rice were dug daily from the sewers to feed pigs. Chapter 23. Wheeling and Dealing. Everyone, from top to bottom, subverted the planned economy, giving free rein to the very profit motive the party sought to eliminate. Survival, Dikötter writes, came to depend on the ability to lie, charm, hide, steal, cheat, pilfer, forge, smuggle, slack, trick, manipulate, or otherwise outwit the state. The country became a nation of gatekeepers, in which everyone could obstruct everyone, and personal connections were needed for everything. One Shanghai storage boss simply staffed his unit with 19 of his own relatives. A vast shadow economy emerged, as enterprises bartered directly, bypassing the plan. A famous Shenyang dumpling shop traded its wares with more than 30 construction units for pipes, cement, and bricks, and paid off the traffic police, the fire brigade, and the toilet cleaners in dumplings. Creative accounting was universal. One factory built a swimming pool billed as a heat-lowering device, and rosters were padded with dead souls, departed or fictitious workers whose rations cadres pocketed. Outright theft ran into hundreds of tons of steel and cement along the railways, and one station's assembly hall was described as a monument to organized theft. Ordinary people traded on the black market, one woman defiantly saying, "I am not a counter-revolutionary. I don't steal and I don't rob, so who cares if I do a bit of business?" A report even noted that such traders were more in touch with real demand than the party. As money lost value, people hoarded goods, reasoning that saving money is not as effective as saving goods, and ration coupons came to serve as a surrogate currency, widely forged. At the very bottom, the desperate sold their possessions, their blood, and even their children. Dikötter records one man who accepted 1.5 yuan and 4 steamed buns for his son. Chapter 24. On the Sly. This chapter examines the covert survival strategies of villagers, which Dikötter is careful to distinguish from heroic resistance. In one Hunan county, he counts 6 successive wins of communism that stripped the villages bare, from the confiscation of silver and china to the seizure of pigs for a giant pigsty. In response, slacking became universal. By 1961, each Shanghai worker produced 40% less value than 2 years earlier, and in the countryside, under lenient leadership, up to half the villagers avoided work, some families hibernating through the winter. Dikötter insists these were not weapons of the weak in some romantic struggle against the state, since the same techniques pervaded the whole social spectrum. Had they truly been resistance, the party would have collapsed. Theft was endemic, driven by need and opportunity. Transport workers were best placed, and at one Wuhan dock, hundreds of employees stripped the freight trains. The practice of eating green, clipping and eating unripe grain from the fields became so widespread that in some communes the harvest almost vanished. one field left as if a swarm of locusts had passed, though those caught were often beaten to death by the militia. As one farmer put it with brutal clarity, those who could not steal died. Those who managed to steal some food did not die. Grain was hidden behind false walls, in coffins and in wardrobes, and some local leaders quietly kept black granaries to help their people, one reasoning that the state's grain is also the people's grain. But Dikötter emphasizes the dark logic of scarcity. Because theft was so pervasive, one person's survival often depended on another's starvation, and it was the weak, the honest, and the vulnerable who suffered most. Chapter 25. Dear Chairman Mao. After Lushan, truth became dangerous and famine a taboo subject, hidden behind euphemisms like natural disasters and temporary difficulties. In some places, the sick were even herded into the mountains and hidden from inspectors. Foreign visitors were duped. Mao told the future French president François Mitterrand that there was no famine, only a period of scarcity, and Mitterrand came away praising him as a great scholar known for the diversity of his genius. Yet ordinary people found channels of dissent through talk, graffiti, nighttime flyers, wall posters, and satirical verse. One popular Shanghai saying went, "All is well under Chairman Mao, a shame no one can eat his fill." Anonymous flyers asked why the people of the country were starving, and answered that all the grain was being shipped to the Soviet Union. Above all, people wrote letters and petitions, in their tens of thousands, many addressed to Mao himself. Dikötter examines closely the belief this reflected, an enduring faith that abuses were merely local, and that if only Mao knew, things would change. One poor girl kept a letter to the chairman stitched inside her coat for a year. But this faith could be fatal. The judicial system had itself collapsed, with the Ministry of Justice abolished, so appeals to law were largely futile. When Liu Shaofi complained that his villagers' letters were being opened, an abusive apparatus came to light, and those whose letters were traced faced terrible retaliation. Dikötter records the case of a man who denounced a corrupt party secretary, was unmasked through handwriting analysis, and had both his eyes gouged out before dying in prison days later. Chapter 26. Robbers and Rebels. Violence by the desperate, in the form of raids, granary attacks, and train robberies, was a last resort, but Dikötter shows that ordinary villagers were rarely the perpetrators of organized rebellion. After the demotion of the Gansu boss Zhang Zhongliang, some 500 train robberies occurred in a single month, with crowds of thousands halting trains and pillaging granaries. Arson spread until, in his phrase, pyromania possessed the countryside. One man set fire to the canteen that had once been his home, shouting, "Get the hell out of here! This canteen belongs to me." Direct violence against cadres, though it happened, was unusual. Underground organizations and secret societies proliferated, and there were ethnic and religious uprisings, including one near Tibet that prompted the Dalai Lama's flight, but none ever seriously threatened the party, and all were brutally crushed. To the credit of the Ministry of Public Security, Dikötter notes, no one was ordered to fire into the crowds. The police focused on ringleaders. Why, then, did the regime survive? Dikötter offers several reasons. Most villagers were simply too weak to rebel. Mild opposition was met with execution or the labor camp. There was no viable alternative to the party, and Lin Biao's purges had forestalled any army coup. But the ultimate stabilizer, he argues, was hope. The most common technique of self-help in times of mass starvation, he writes, was a simple device called hope, the belief, as in imperial times, that the emperor was benevolent even if his servants were corrupt. Abusive cadres were thought to be disobeying a beneficent Mao. If only he knew, people told themselves, everything would be different. Meanwhile, most simply endured, in the Chinese phrase, by eating bitterness. Chapter 27. Exodus. The most effective survival strategy was to leave the village altogether. The leap ironically drove a tidal migration to the cities, more than 15 million farmers in 1958 alone, swelling the urban population from 99 to 130 million. These migrants formed an underclass with no legal status, taking the dirty and dangerous jobs and living without rations or security. When the state clamped down in early 1959, restricting movement to protect dwindling city reserves, the cordon was defeated by networks of kin who sent money and instructions home. Farmers boarded freight trains ticketless in their tens of thousands, In the first 4 months of 1960, over 170,000 were found riding without tickets around Beijing alone. Some who left prospered, earning 100 yuan a month at the docks, while others were reduced to theft, begging, or selling sex for a ration coupon. The state responded with brute force, operating over 600 so-called dissuasion stations, where runaways were detained without trial, robbed of their coupons, and beaten, some raped. Yet the refugees rarely gave up. Of one group escorted back, most escaped again. As the villages emptied of their healthy young men, they came to feel, in one description, quarantined, as if peopled by lepers, and labor shortages left ghost villages behind. The exodus eventually spilled across China's borders, into Burma, into the Soviet Union, from Xinjiang, where some 64,000 crossed in 1962, and, in May of that year, into Hong Kong, which Dikötter says became the Free Berlin of the East, as the flow peaked at over 5,000 a day. No country, the colonial secretary lamented, was in practice willing to share the burden. In the end, the state proved the more resilient, forcibly returning some 20 million people from the cities to the countryside, beginning in 1961. Chapter 28. Children. Collectivization dismantled the family's protective role over children. Communal nurseries and kindergartens, hastily set up to free women for labor, were overwhelmed and ramshackle, breeding grounds for disease where adults routinely stole the children's rations. In 3/4 of Guangzhou's kindergartens, food was pilfered by the staff. In the nurseries, one account recalled everybody cried, the children first, then the inexperienced carers, then the reluctant mothers. Older children had their schooling suspended for forced labor in the fields and the steel campaigns, some fainting at the furnaces. Under collectivization, Dikötter shows, children were treated as adult workers, bossed by cadres, and punished as harshly, sometimes fatally, for the smallest infraction, such as taking food. He records children imprisoned, crippled, and in the worst cases, beaten or buried alive for petty theft. As the famine deepened, families were pushed to terrible extremes, abandoning children, selling them, or favoring one over another in the agonizing division of food. In Nanjing, over 2,000 children were abandoned in 1959, 4 times the total of the entire previous decade of communist rule, most of them sick, and 6 in 10 of them girls. Dikötter tells the story of one 8-year-old girl who supported a family of 6, once slipping in the rain and spilling the porridge she had queued an hour to collect. She scraped it up from the ground, full of sand, because otherwise the family might go crazy with hunger. He also follows Zhao Xiaobai, an 11-year-old orphan who protected her younger sister and brought her home across the country to their grandmother. Asked how she became the person she was, she answered simply, through suffering. The famine also sharply reduced the birth rate, so that fewer children were born even as more died. Chapter 29. Women. Collectivization, though it claimed to liberate women, worsened their position. Before the leap, in much of the country, women had earned income through domestic handicrafts, weaving, spinning, and embroidery from home. Now mobilized into field labor at the Bugle's call, women were paid less under a work-point system that rewarded male strength, while the state did little to ease their domestic burdens. In a regime that traded food for work, weakness meant hunger, and so menstruation and pregnancy were penalized. Dikötter records appalling abuses. Pregnant women forced to break ice in winter, a party secretary who made women claiming menstruation drop their trousers for cursory inspection, and cases of women crippled or killed by beatings. Malnutrition itself stopped menstruation and produced widespread gynecological disease, including prolapsed uterus, which afflicted as many as 1 in 5 working women in Hunan. The collapse of social protections, as men left for the army, the irrigation projects, and the cities, left women acutely vulnerable to sexual abuse, which Dikötter says spread like a contagion, with party officials raping dozens of women each. There were sex-specific humiliations, too. Women forced to work naked under a reward system that leaders defended as breaking feudal taboos, and nude parades that drove some to suicide, along with a grim traffic in women sold as wives from famished Gansu. Yet the chapter closes on a paradox. Despite this immense suffering and discrimination, women were not the greatest mortality victims. Drawing on comparisons with the Bengal famine and the work of the historian Michel McAlpin, who wrote that women may be better able than men to withstand the trials of a period of famine, Dikötter notes their skill at the survival strategies of foraging and trading. In the end, he concludes, the greatest victims of the famine were the young and the elderly. Chapter 30. The Elderly. Dikötter argues that the Great Leap, not the later Cultural Revolution, was the true watershed in the moral collapse that destroyed traditional care for the elderly. Rural life had always been hard, and strict filial piety was beyond most, captured in the proverb that with 9 sons and 23 grandchildren, a man may still have to dig his own grave. But before 1949, the old could count on a measure of care and dignity, their mere survival commanding respect. By substituting the state for the family, collectivization broke that bond. Villagers in Macheng complained that the communes left children without their mothers, women without their husbands, and the elderly without relatives. Retirement homes for the childless, over 100,000 at their peak, quickly became places of theft, forced labor, neglect, and slow starvation. Under a regime that exchanged food for labor, the elderly, unable to work at full capacity, were, in Dikötter's stark phrase, dispensable. Hunger, he emphasizes, was never simply a matter of a lack of resources, but of their distribution. One cook told the residents in his care, "What point is there in feeding you? If we feed the pigs, at least we will get some meat." In the whole of Hunan province, Dikötter records, only just over 1,000 people survived in the remaining homes by the end of the famine. Like children, the elderly were harshly punished for small offenses, and their families made to share in it. In one case, a daughter-in-law beaten bloody for refusing to strike her father-in-law. And when the villages emptied, as everyone fled in search of food, it was the elderly and the handicapped who were left behind, alone, sometimes eating the leaves from the trees, to die. Chapter 31. Accidents. Poor safety was endemic to the command economy. Despite an elaborate apparatus of inspectors, trade unions, and labor legislation, the obsession with output, combined with fatigue, shortages, and worker apathy, made accidents a major and largely uncounted source of death. Both the zealots who cut corners and the dawdlers sunk in collective inertia undermined safety, while shortages pushed people toward riskier self-help. From stoves and thatched huts to stolen safety equipment, life, Dikötter writes, was cheap, costing a lot less than installing safety equipment or enforcing labor law. Failing a production target could end a manager's career, while violating labor safety was a mere slap on the wrist. The foreign minister Chen Yi again dismissed industrial accidents with the words, "It's nothing." After all, he implied, what were a few deaths in the battle for a better future? Fires destroyed enormous amounts of property, an estimated 7,000 of them causing 100 million yuan in losses in 1958, even as the factories that made firefighting equipment were shut down for self-sufficiency. Industrial accidents soared as safety itself was branded rightist conservatism, and enterprises concealed the toll. Mining disasters were common. In the worst single case, 677 miners died in one day at Datong. One of Mao's secretaries later estimated 50,000 fatal industrial accidents in 1958 alone, and the Ministry of Labor recorded some 13,000 deaths in the first 8 months of 1960, over 50 a day. Transport was equally lethal, with ferries running 3 times over capacity and passengers marooned for up to 30 hours in frozen train carriages without food or water, corpses accumulating as they waited. On the buses of Guangzhou, people were crammed, in one description, like pigs. During the famine, even a minor injury could prove fatal, since absence from work meant a reduced food ration. Chapter 32. Disease. This chapter makes a striking observation. China saw a comparatively low incidence of the classic famine epidemics, like typhus and cholera, because the party rapidly isolated outbreaks with military cordons. When cholera appeared in Guangdong in 1961, the army sealed off the region and kept the casualties low. Instead, collectivization's destruction of daily life produced a wide range of other illnesses, and people, Dikötter emphasizes, really did die directly of starvation, more quickly than in most famines. The health system, battered by the leap, was overwhelmed and then collapsed, and hospitals themselves became, in his phrase, catalysts in the spread of disease, with makeshift emergency centers set up in cowsheds where the living shared beds with the dead. Mao dismissed his own doctor's warnings, saying, "You doctors are just upsetting people by talking about disease. I just don't believe you." The chapter documents surges in measles, polio, meningitis, and hepatitis, the last affecting even the privileged residents of the cities, along with malaria, snail fever, and outbreaks of mental illness and mass hysteria. It also details widespread poisoning from the desperate consumption of substitute foods, from cassava and cocklebur to fertilizer balls mistaken for bean cakes, and to a chlorella grown in human urine, whose nutrients were locked in indigestible cell walls. People ate anything green, as one survivor recalled, and in the extremity of hunger turned to a fine mud known as Goddess of Mercy soil, which offered a brief sense of fullness before it blocked the intestines and killed. Dikötter provides a clinical account of the stages of starvation and edema, describing how the brain, in his words, quite literally starts cannibalizing the body. A madman's jingle, he records, captures the horror. Man eats man, dog eats dog, even rats are so hungry that they nibble away at stones. Chapter 33. The Gulag. A vast and layered system of incarceration underpinned the regime. It included the formal reform through labor camps, the re-education camps that operated without any judicial procedure, and countless local, informal punishment camps run by communes and villages. Ordinary people received long sentences for trivial offenses. Dikötter cites a former soldier jailed 12 years for stealing 2 pairs of trousers worth 17 yuan, and an illiterate thief given 15. Conditions were lethal. At the notorious Jiabiangu camp on the edge of the Gobi Desert in Gansu, a large proportion of the prisoners starved to death before it was closed. The official policy after 1958, in the words of the security minister Shei Fuji, was to arrest fewer, kill fewer, and supervise fewer. But this merely shifted the killing from execution to starvation. Dikötter stresses that formal justice was curtailed almost to nothing. Mao declared that every one of our party resolutions is a law. When we have a conference, it becomes the law. The Ministry of Justice was abolished in 1959, shifting power to the local militias, and in one county of over 800,000 people, the entire legal apparatus was reduced to 80 cadres. These informal camps ranged from the model commune of Shushu, which ran a gulag holding 1.5% of the local population, to a brigade with 4 camps imposing sentences of up to 150 days. Estimating the formal camp population at around 1.8 million, and the informal re-education population at several times that, Dikötter reckons a total prisoner population of 8 to 9 million in any given year, and concludes that at least 3 million people died in this gulag during the famine. Yet the incarceration rate was low compared to Stalin's Soviet Union, for a grim reason. Comparatively few people actually did time for crime. They were beaten and starved instead. Chapter 34. Violence. This chapter argues that terror was the very foundation of the regime, and that during the leap violence became a routine, systematic tool of control directed against the majority of villagers. To be effective, Dikötter notes, terror had to be arbitrary and ruthless, following the old maxims to kill a chicken to scare the monkey, and to punish one to deter 100. With every incentive to work destroyed, and exhausted farmers sleeping only 3 or 4 hours in the plowing season, amid endless meetings and loudspeakers, cadres under mounting pressure turned to the stick as the weapon of choice. Edema victims were beaten, in one witness's words, until all the water came out. As one cadre told his colleagues, "If you want to be a party member, you must know how to beat people." Dikötter estimates that perhaps half of all cadres regularly beat people, and catalogs a harrowing repertoire of torture. Victims thrown into ponds, stripped naked in the cold, buried alive, mutilated with ears and noses lopped off, branded with hot tools, and made to swallow excrement. In one case, reported to the central leadership, a man had his ear chopped off, his legs wired, and a stone tied to his back, all for digging up a potato. Of the Red Guards a decade later, Dikötter observes, they invented very little. The violence flowed from the top down, through what he calls the reward principle. Cadres beating in order to earn praise. As one interviewee explained, the people above us squeeze us, so we squeeze the people below us. Food itself was the weapon of first resort, with rations graded by performance in a system he compares to the Nazi practice of feeding forced laborers by output, so that the weak were slowly starved as punishment. Dikötter concludes that at least 6 to 8% of the famine's victims, likely at least 2.5 million people, were beaten or tortured to death, while suicide reached epidemic proportions, claiming perhaps 1 to 3 million more. Chapter 35. Sites of Horror. The party treated the Xinjiang atrocity as an isolated incident, an aberration to be blamed on counter-revolutionaries, but Dikötter demonstrates that counties with death rates above 10% in a single year existed across the entire country. He offers a provisional list of 56 such counties, drawn from the work of the demographer Wang Weiji, and expanded from the archives, and examines several in detail. In Tongwei, Gansu, where the county head reported a bumper harvest of 130,000 tons, as output actually collapsed toward 18,000, some 60,000 people died, and over 1,000 were beaten or tortured to death. In Dikötter's chilling phrase, people were beaten to death and made into compost. A superior official there declared, "I would rather that people die of hunger than ask the state for grain." Across Sichuan, Guizhou, Shandong, and above all Anhui under Zheng Shisheng, whole regions were devastated. In Fuling, Sichuan, up to a third died in some villages. In Meitan, Guizhou, 45,000 died in 6 months. In Qihei, Shandong, a fifth of the population was lost. But it was in the Fuyang region of Anhui that a population of 8 million lost over 2.4 million people in 3 years, amid entrapment schemes in which farmers were lured with bean cakes, then locked in and beaten with iron bars. Everywhere the pattern was the same, a lethal combination of deceit, driven by the political pressure to report success and terror. Nie Rongzhen even told Mao that Guizhou was not poor at all, but very rich, and should become an industrial base. These, Dikötter insists, were not aberrations, but the predictable outcome of the system operating exactly as designed. Chapter 36. Cannibalism. Cannibalism did occur, but Dikötter argues the reality was far less sensational than either the party, which suppressed all mention of it, or its enemies, who used it as a metaphor for the whole system, portrayed. He opens with the eerie, unnatural silence that descended on the countryside after years of famine, with no pigs, no chickens, and no birds. The practice began in Yunnan, where the famine started, and spread to every decimated region, even reaching prosperous Guangdong. Human flesh was occasionally traded on the black market, mixed with dog meat to escape detection, and local bosses frequently covered up the reports, blaming bad elements or even accusing saboteurs of faking cannibalism to tarnish the party. But most who ate human flesh, Dikötter shows, were scavengers practicing necrophagy on those already dead, not murderers. He draws on a detailed document from Lingxia in Gansu, which categorized 76 victims into those killed and eaten, those eaten after death, and the great majority, those exhumed and eaten, and on a close investigation in Sichuan, to demonstrate that killing specifically in order to eat was rare, and killing within a family rarer still, with only a single such case in the Lingxia list. Employing a useful Russian distinction between people eating and corpse eating, he treats the subject soberly and refuses to sensationalize it. His conclusion is deliberately restrained and, in its way, more damning than any lurid account. In the midst of state-sponsored violence, he writes, necrophagy was neither the most common nor the most widespread way of degrading a human being. Chapter 37. The Final Tally. In the final chapter, Dikötter confronts the question of how many died, acknowledging at once that there will never be a fully satisfactory answer. He surveys the prior estimates, which ranged from Basil Ashton's and Judith Bannister's roughly 30 million, through Yang Jisheng's 36 million, to Zheng Chang's 38 million, and the historical demographer Cao Shuji's 32.5 million, the last reached by working through more than 1,000 local gazetteers. He then explains why the official figures understate the toll. In a one-party state, he argues, there is no need for anybody to falsify figures. It is merely a matter of compiling a set of statistics which appears to be the least politically damaging. The very definition of a normal death was political. Officials capped reported death rates and reclassified deaths from emaciation and edema so as not to appear damaging. Testing the archives county by county, Dikötter repeatedly finds death tolls that exceed the official and gazetteer figures by 50 to 100%, and sometimes by a factor of 3 or 4. In Sichuan alone, the most devastated province, its own Security Bureau data imply nearly 8 million excess deaths. He argues there was no incentive to exaggerate deaths, and every incentive to inflate the living population for the sake of ration entitlements. A 1963 check found the population padded by 1 to 1.5%. This evidence, he concludes, vindicates the figure of 43 to 46 million, reached around 1980 by a team of 200 investigators under Zhao Ziyang, whose findings were never published but were later revealed by the exiled official Chen Yizi. The death toll, Dikötter writes, thus stands at a minimum of 45 million excess deaths for the Great Famine of 1958 to 62, and he notes that some researchers put it higher still, at 50 to 60 million. Epilogue. The epilogue turns to the political aftermath. In January 1962, 7,000 cadres gathered in the Great Hall of the People for the largest work conference the party had ever held. There, the head of state, Liu Shaoqi, delivered the official report, speaking for 3 hours, and describing the catastrophe, in the Hunanese phrase, as 30% natural calamity and 70% man-made disaster. Using the word man-made, Dikötter writes, was a bombshell that drew gasps. Liu dismissed Mao's favorite formula that the achievements outweighed the setbacks by 9 fingers to 1, suggesting the real ratio was closer to 7 to 3, and placed the blame squarely on the central leadership. Mao interrupted, annoyed, but Liu refused to be intimidated. Lin Biao, by contrast, rhapsodized that the thoughts of Chairman Mao were always correct, while Zhou Enlai absorbed blame himself, saying this is my mistake, in an effort to bridge the gap. Mao was privately furious, telling his doctor that this kind of talk was a disaster in itself. In a confrontation that summer, with Mao summoned back from his swimming pool, Liu warned him that so many people have died of hunger, and that history will judge you and me. Even cannibalism will go into the books. Mao raged that the 3 red banners were being shot down, that land was being divided up again, and demanded to know what would happen after he was dead. He concluded that he had found his own Khrushchev, the trusted deputy who would one day denounce his master, as Khrushchev had denounced Stalin. To protect his legacy, he began the patient groundwork for the campaign that would become the Cultural Revolution, a campaign that would tear the party and the country apart, and that would ultimately destroy Liu Shaoqi himself. Closing synthesis. Taken together, the argument of Mao's Great Famine is that the catastrophe of 1958 to 62 was neither a natural disaster nor an unfortunate byproduct of well-intentioned policy, but a man-made disaster driven from the top by Mao Zedong and enabled by a chain of responsibility running through the entire party. Dikötter shows how utopian targets, the abolition of truth-telling at Lushan, and the systematic use of food, terror, and violence as instruments of control combined to kill at least 45 million people, at least 2.5 million of them beaten or tortured to death. His deeper contribution, drawn from the newly opened archives, is to restore the texture of ordinary life and death, to reveal how villagers lied, stole, slacked, fled, and hoped their way toward survival, how the planned economy corroded into a shadow economy of barter and theft, and how the weakest members of society, the children and the elderly, paid the highest price of all. The book stands as an argument that the famine was not a tragic accident, but the direct and foreseeable consequence of a political system built on coercion.